Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice is drawing on her government experience to help other leaders understand today's political landscape around the world. Her new book is called Political Risk: How Businesses and Organizations Can Anticipate Global Insecurity. It is co-authored by fellow Stanford professor Amy Ziegert. We welcome Secretary Rice back to Studio 57. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's talk first about North Korea. President Trump has described North Korea's leader yesterday as very open and very straightforward so far. Do you believe Kim Jong Un will ever abandon his nuclear weapons program?
Well, the North Koreans have made a lot of promises about denuclearization. I think I may have been the last Secretary of State to actually negotiate with the North Koreans back in 2007, 2008, early 2009. And they're under pressure, as they were then. They have a tendency when they're under pressure, under sanctions, to come to the table, to go on a kind of charm offensive. In fact, I think Secretary Tillerson, former Secretary Tillerson, actually deserves a lot of credit for putting together a pretty tough isolation campaign. One of the things that wasn't noticed, about 20 countries expelled North Korean workers. That meant hard currency, going back to the regime, was cut off. The regime was starting to run out of military parts. So they come to the table. Now the question is, are they serious? I would have only 3 admonitions for the administration. The first is, this could be an opening. This is the first time we've dealt this directly. I was impressed with Secretary Pompeo, then CIA Director Pompeo, getting to Pyongyang, and none of us knew. That's pretty amazing. And then, so we're negotiating directly. That's good. But the 3 admonitions: don't forget that there are other interested parties. For instance, Japan has very important interest here. Secondly, take it one step at a time. It's fine to talk about a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, we talked about a peace treaty. That should be the ultimate goal. But go step by step, make sure there's good verification of everything the North Koreans are doing, and keep your eye on the prize of denuclearization. Because what we want to do is stop them short of threatening the American homeland. And then finally, remember the nature of this regime. This is a regime that murdered an American citizen just a year ago. This is a regime where the leader killed his half-brother in Malaysia using VX gas. It's a brutal regime, a secretive regime. I have no problem with negotiating with them, but beware.
We talked about the inspections regime with the Iran deal. What, for you, is the most important part of an inspections regime, if there is a deal one day, to make sure that they don't cheat? And what should people be looking for?
Well, the most important thing about an inspection regime with a country that you know has cheated in the past is what I would call snap inspections, meaning that you can go anywhere, anytime that you wish to send inspectors there. These regimes are very good at, for instance, cleaning up a site after they've been notified that you want to look at that site. And so they tend to list their known sites, but hide other sites. And so you have to be able to go anywhere, anytime. But let me just say, getting inspectors on the ground can make a difference. And I hope that one of the first steps in these North Korean negotiations would be to get inspectors, International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, on the ground, because our intelligence about North Korea is not very good. Being on the ground with experienced people, you pick up things that you wouldn't be able to pick up through other means.
We talk about the president and the Iran deal and the fact that he may potentially withdraw from that. How might that affect negotiations with North Korea?
Well, some have said the North Koreans will then think that America's not trustworthy, right? But this would be a little bit the pot calling the kettle black, right? I mean, the North Koreans saying Americans aren't trustworthy, I'm not too worried about that.
So you don't think there would be any long-term
I don't really think
that
this would be an issue. The North Koreans are going to negotiate, if they negotiate, because it's in their interest to do so, because they're under pressure. What has happened with Iran, I think, isn't the issue. It might be a little bit of an object lesson, though, for Kim Jong Un, that we negotiated with Muammar Gaddafi, and Gaddafi didn't end up so well. I think that may be more in his memory bank than what we do with Iran.
In your book, you call the landscape the most complex security environment in modern history. How have those political risks evolved since you were Secretary of State? And has President Trump made it better or worse?
Well, there's no doubt that the sources of political risk are multiplying. If one thinks about the old days, we worried about if you were a business, they're going to expropriate my property, Cuba or the like. Not so much a risk anymore. But who would have thought that one of the big risks would be the use of social media platforms for a great power behaving badly, the Russians, to interfere in our elections? That's one of the new ways in which technology matters. When you think about the risk that comes from somebody simply having a cell phone, and seeing a bad incident in your store. When you think about long supply chains and what trade wars or tariffs could do to supply chains that, for instance, are in Canada or in Mexico. The day after 9/11, we closed the border with Canada. Within 3 days, nobody could make a car because the supply chain was in Canada. When you start threatening trade wars, you threaten things like supply chains. So I think the sources of political risk are multiplying anyway, but anything that adds to that uncertainty, like talk around tariffs and trade wars, certainly increases that uncertainty for businesses.
Well, that brings us then to this president. Usually in the global order after the Second World War, the United States was the stable, slow-moving rock upon which people could depend. We have a highly improvisational president who gets some credit for North Korea from foes and critics alike.
Yes.
However, that sense of improvisation, trade war here, maybe not a trade war there. You talked about alliance management. There have been some bruised feelings with alliances. Yeah. How much has he contributed to this level of risk, and how do you manage against that?
Well, there's certainly a sense that there's volatility in the American political landscape that is unusual in our history. But I wouldn't overstate it to the point that, well, this president is therefore the source of political risk. I think that's unfair. You know, the fact is, these sources of political risk have been multiplying for some time now. When terrorism became an issue, it meant that as we hardened airports, for instance, if you were in the hospitality industry, all of a sudden you were a soft target. The risks that come from cybersecurity have been multiplying for some time. So yes, the United States is always better for people when we're stable and steady and so forth. But these sources of political risk have been multiplying for a long time.
I wonder, as someone who has been in the war room, how critical is it for a president to be surrounded with or have access to advisors who have opposing points of view?
It's absolutely critical that the president hear opposing points of view. It can be very easy in that room, the Situation Room, for everyone to start reinforcing each other. And so the president needs to be able to hear, no, Mr. President, that's not right. He needs also to be able to hear it in a way from his advisors that it doesn't appear, with all due respect to the media, on the front page of the New York Times.
Right. Well, is that a concern for you, given this president and the structure of his current administration?
Well, it's a concern for me because it looks to me that some of the constraints, some of the barriers that people felt about being in the White House and keeping that within the cone, that some of that has broken down. But that said, this is a different president. He's never been in government before. It's the first time that we've actually elected somebody whose first job in government was President of the United States. And so we had to expect that there would be some differences. He still has many very good people around him. But I hope going into this very important set of negotiations with North Korea that you're going to see a disciplined process, because the North Koreans are masters at taking advantage of loopholes and weaknesses. And so I believe that Secretary Pompeo looks like he's going about it in the right way, but this is going to take real discipline.
Let me ask you one question about political risk and this world in which everybody's interconnected and things are more threatening than ever. Make the case or not for diplomacy in such a world where you can have problems break out at any moment. Is that connectivity? Should America reach out to the world or withdraw?
America has to reach out to the world. We have been, since the end of World War II, the guardians of a system that has served everybody really very well. A prosperous international economy that was not zero-sum game. Before World War II and World War I, people were engaging in beggar-thy-neighbor trading policies, currency manipulation, conflict over resources. We came along and said, you know, this can be a positive sum game where everybody wins. Lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The international economy worked. We advocated for democracy. We believed in a democratic peace. We rebuilt Germany and Japan as great democracies, believing that they could be strong as long as they were democratic. It worked splendidly, and we protected it with American military power and American attention to values. And I hope that we're going to hear more about that, because it's worked pretty well for the world, and it's worked pretty well for us. I know it hasn't worked for every single corner of America, and there the president is right. We have to look at what's happening to our fellow citizens. Can't have any more third graders who can't read. Can't have any more kids who go to college, get lots of debt, and no usable job skills. You can't have any more 35-year-olds who can't be retrained. So he is right to focus on that aspect of America, that people have to be able to benefit from the American dream. But my goodness, I can't think of a better guardian of an international system built on our values and our interests than the United States of America.
Can I ask you too just about the state of the White House, because you worked with George W. Bush so closely in that White House. There were reports last night that the president's chief of staff has called the president an idiot, that his former Secretary of State at the time, Tillerson, who you know well, called him a moron. What does that say about how this White House is being operated?
Well, it says something about people who would go out and say those things about conversations that they did or did not hear within the White House. That's that breakdown of discipline. It's been coming for a while. You know, it's not just this administration that's had damaging leaks, but you know, the level of comedy in a White House. You know, these jobs are hard enough. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You don't need to get up in the morning and read in the newspaper that somebody is saying something about the president, whatever you may think about the president. I've had my disagreements with this president, but and I have many, but he is president of the United States. Let's respect the office, because it's extremely important that the White House function as a unit.
Secretary Rice, thank you so much. The new book, Political Risk: How Businesses and Organizations Can Anticipate Global Insecurity, is on sale today.